Telling ghost stories is a pretty common experience, but what's much less common is when the storyteller is the ghoul itself. This just happens to be the premise of Vetal tales, a collection of fairy tales from India. Similar to the famous Scheherazade from 1001 Arabian Nights, this ghoul must tell a king 25 stories to avoid being sacrificed by a yogi. But the ghoul has a pretty interesting story of his own. Today's fairy tale guest stars my pal Maria and was edited by follower Krishna.
It's time for Folklore with Friends. Bonk.
Once there was a king named Vikram who made an astonishing discovery. He'd been frequently receiving gifts of fruit from a yogi, and he'd been letting the fruit rot. But then he discovered that each fruit contained a jewel pit at its center. He quickly recovered whatever fruit he could and used those surprise valuables to fund some initiatives in the poorer communities of his kingdom. And then he summoned the yogi to find out why he was receiving such extravagant gifts.
What's the deal with this fancy fruit?
I need your help with a spiritual quest. There is a corpse hanging from a banyan tree on the south side of the forest, about 20 miles from here. I need a brave man who can retrieve it for me so I can use it for ceremonial purposes. Would you help me out in exchange for all those sweet, sweet jewels I gave you? The king agreed, and one moonless night he found himself staring up at the corpse he was sent to retrieve. He cut the body from the tree, threw it over his shoulder, and began to tote it back. But the body had been possessed by a ghoul, and this ghoul had reasons to avoid the yogi who had summoned him. So what have I done to deserve this impromptu piggyback ride from a king?
Honestly, I am not sure. But a yogi asked me to retrieve you, and I am under an obligation to do so.
I don't love the sound of that. Look, it's a really long journey. Why don't I entertain us with a story along the way?
This seems like one of those situations where there's a catch.
There is a catch. Each of my stories will have a riddle at the end. If you can answer the riddle correctly, I get to go back to my tree. But if you're stumped, I stay by your side.
It seems like if I know the answer, I could just keep it to myself and pretend that I'm stumped.
That's a logical assumption, but if you do that, your head will explode into 1,000 pieces.
Literally?
Yes. My riddles are that mind-blowing.
I'll take a story time over exploded head any day.
For the next 24 nights, the king would pick up the ghoul, who would share a story with him that had a riddle at the end. King Vikram was a smart guy, and he correctly guessed all of the riddles he was given. When this happened, the ghoul would be free of Vikram's clutches, and he would scamper back to his banyan tree. But the 25th story was different. Tonight's story begins in a war-torn country. A man and his son have been wandering the destruction. Amidst the debris, they discover the queen and the princess of the land alive. The man and his son take the two women under their protection, and eventually the women go home with them. And down the road, love grew between the two couples. But the couples didn't work out the way you're thinking. The father married the princess, and the son married the queen.
That did not work out the way I was thinking.
Never underestimate the love of an older woman, my friend.
Okay, so what's the riddle here?
Eventually, each of the couples had a child. The queen and her young husband had a son, and the father and his younger wife had a daughter. My riddle is, how are the two newborn children related?
That is a really good question. I'm stumped.
I know you're stumped. You know how I know?
Because my head didn't explode?
Because your head didn't explode!
Okay, so the father's baby is his son's sibling, so they're half siblings. But also they're in-laws somehow, and they're cousins too? What's the word for cousin siblings-in-law? Oh my god, I think my head is going to explode.
It seems like you don't know the answer to this, which is a shame because I'd kind of like to know the answer myself. But since you're stumped, I remain your prisoner.
We have time for another story. Why don't you tell me your own?
You want me to tell my life story?
At the very least, tell me why this yogi is interested in you.
Oh, well, the yogi needs to sacrifice me to gain immortality, and then he plans to kill you and eventually rule the world.
What? Way to bury the lead!
See, what happened was, the yogi sort of raised me and my brother. He was our primary educator. When we were growing up, it seemed like I was his favorite because he would go above and beyond in his education of me, whereas he taught my brother just the basics. Turns out he needed me to become as knowledgeable as I am so that he could sacrifice me.
I don't suppose with all that knowledge, you know how I can stop the yogi.
You bet I do. See, when you visit him, the yogi is planning to behead you when you bow to the goddess. But if you ask the yogi how to properly perform this ceremony, when he shows you, you can behead him first. For some reason, the bad guys in these stories always fall for that. You'd think they'd know by now. And that is how Vikram saved his own life and that of the ghoul. In thanks for rescuing him, the ghoul offered Vikram 2 gifts. For the first, the king asked the ghoul to remain in his service as needed. But for his second gift, he decided to pay it forward. He asked that the yogi's heart and soul be cleansed of his sins, and that his life be renewed for a second chance. What a refreshing end to a fairy tale. While it can definitely be cathartic to see the bad guys get what's coming to them, real-world softy Liz does wish that we could be a lot more restorative with our justice. Today's video was just based on one version of the Vetal tales. There are regional differences between versions of the stories, as well as translation differences, and the tales in that collection have inspired multiple films and TV series in India. A while back, I shared a video based on one of the internal tales of this collection, 3 Fastidious Men. But my patron Krishna specifically requested that I tell the frame story of this tale, and I'm so glad she did. Thanks to my friend Maria for stepping in. You should follow her if you enjoy TV and movie content because, as her handle indicates, she truly does watch everything. And if you'd like to request a fairy tale be moved to the top of my queue, you can join my Patreon. Patrons get to upvote themes and stories, as well as request their personal favorites. Thanks for watching!
Folklore with friends.
Bonk.